today is Palm Sunday, and I'd like to focus on that part of the readings which dealt with the triumphal entry of Jesus into Jerusalem. And in these readings we see various kinds of leadership, which you still also would see in the world today, and other kinds and possibilities. You find here the high priests and their particular way of manipulating the crowds and influencing them. You find Pontius Pilate, who was a cruel man, and in our time, of course, we have some cruel people. We've had Stalin killing, whatever it was, 30 million Russians. You had Hitler, who was a demagogue. You have here in these readings, you have some inspiring leadership of the people. And we know inspiring speakers and leaders, like we could think of people like John Kennedy and Martin Luther King, Winston Churchill in the Second World War. And to look around, I suppose, if we were to think what leaders usually are, is we are sometimes given to expect them to be attractive, the loudest, loud, wild, sometimes, who are influential, perhaps rich, or particularly strong, self-assertive. I know Harvard Business School, whether you're an introvert or an extrovert, wants you to behave like an extrovert by the time you leave. You need to look like you're in charge wherever you go, and you need to be decisive and forceful in your opinions. And yet, Sue Stone lent me a best-selling book this week by Susan Cain, written in 2012, and the title of that is Quiet, the Power of Introspective People, which seemed to echo with some of what we read today in the Gospel reading from Mark 11, 1 to 11, about the triumphal entry. And Susan Cain, in that book of hers, it's a remarkable book, well worthwhile reading, but if you don't have time to read it, she also gave what's called one of the TED lectures, and if you just Google the power of introverts, you'll see her TED lecture. And I think there's been about 1,300 TED lectures by prominent speakers on important subjects, and they're all excellent. But Susan Cain, within 1 month of giving her TED lectures, the viewership of it had put her up in the top 10 of all those 1,300 lectures. So that is definitely one of those lectures that's worth seeing, and you'll see some of what I'm speaking about now in what she says. She's obviously a great speaker, although she's an introvert herself. And she says some of the great leaders of the world are not those extroverted sort of people. And she quoted, for example, the chief executive officer of IBM, and she says a number of chief executive officers are not actually extroverted people. They not comfortable in front of large crowds of people. They prefer to walk with small crowds of people. They prefer to think. They prefer to be alone or need time alone. And she quotes other people as well, from other kind of parts of the whole field of knowledge. Mary Curie, for example, was an introvert. She quotes Mahatma Gandhi, despite all that public work of his, that was an introvert, preferred to be alone if he could choose to. And Albert Einstein, who was, of course, said to be the person of the century, Time magazine's person of the century for the 20th century, another introvert. Alan Turing, from whom digital computing began during the Second World War, just after it. So these are all people who like to be alone. And there are some aspects of Jesus' life, I'm sure, who could ever put Jesus into a psychological category? And I'm not trying to do that, but I am saying there are some things about his life which sort of resonate with the way introverts act. For example, here in Mark's Gospel, in chapter 4, we're told that Jesus regularly, every day, rose a great while before dawn to pray. So there he had a couple of hours all by himself in prayer with God. We're told in Luke's Gospel that he would always pray for the big decisions and turning points of that Gospel. For example, the choice of the apostles, or as we see here in Gethsemane, there's deep prayer for Jesus, not only every day, but particularly at these turning moments in his life. Many of his parables and discourses, I mean, if you think of somebody like Churchill or even Kennedy or Martin Luther King, they would make sure that there was some setting. It would be at the Lincoln Memorial, right? And there would be a whole march of people, and then there would be the speech. But for Jesus, most of his discourses, as we call them, are not in those sort of settings. They're usually in response to what an individual says to him. And an example is in John chapter 3, when Nicodemus comes to speak to him. And then we get that great discourse, which includes John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. And then the woman at the well in the next chapter of John's Gospel, she asks him these questions, and he responds to them. And it's because of his depth of knowledge of that individual, as she said, come and listen to a man who told me everything I ever did. So he's deeply aware of that individual that he's speaking to. But he's also deeply aware of the Hebrew Scriptures. You could see it just flows out of him, that very intimate knowledge that he had of the Hebrew Scriptures. For example, in the temptation, when he responds to the devil, he's quoting continually from Deuteronomy chapter 6 and chapter 8. And he has a deeply inflected understanding of the Hebrew Scriptures and how they can be understood one way or another way. He quotes Psalm 110 to characterize his role as the Messiah. And here in this reading, he does it again, because when he doesn't actually say so, but when he gets on that donkey, that colt, he's then goes into Jerusalem on the east gate side of Jerusalem and the temple. He's fulfilling a prophecy of what the Messiah would do, that the Messiah, when the Messiah came, would come into the east gate of Jerusalem and the temple. And that is where, so he's fulfilling this prediction about the Messiah. But he does it in his own way. He doesn't do it as a conquering, mighty military victor. He gets on top of a donkey, and in that he is quoting this little verse, this tiny little verse from Zechariah 9, verse 9. Nobody would have been expecting that the Messiah would get on the donkey. But here it says, behold, your Messiah comes to you, mounted on the foal of an ass, that is a little donkey. So, if you can think of, I try to imagine the opening of the General Assembly of the United Nations, and imagine all these great leaders from all over the world gathering here to make their speeches. Can you imagine if down those little side streets of the west side of New York, they all came riding there on a donkey? I can't see it, can you? Because a donkey is not something you want to get on if you plan to get anywhere fast. They can stop at any time of the day, and if they decide they're not moving, they're not moving. Those national leaders might arrive on a war horse of some kind, or a chariot of some kind, as the Queen of England does, but not riding on a donkey. So Jesus, first of all, there's a symbol of his humility here. The kind of Messiah that he is, the kind of leader of Israel and of the world that he is a humble leader. He is the Lamb of God that is coming. Secondly, that he's coming on this donkey chimes in with another part of Mark's Gospel, and that is God's control of nature. You couldn't, as far as I know, not that I ever have ridden a foal, but I would imagine that to get on top of a horse or a donkey that has not been trained to carry somebody, they wouldn't cooperate, right? They might throw you, for example. But he gets on this donkey that has never seen him and he has never seen it, and rides exactly the way that he wants to into Jerusalem. So it's God's control of nature. And you see that in many places in this gospel. And the reason that God's control of nature flows through Jesus, as we have in the temptation, is because Jesus is first of all obedient to God, secondly that he trusts God, and thirdly that he's loyal to God. Because he is obedient, trusting, and loyal, totally obedient, totally trusting, and totally loyal, then the God who controls nature through Jesus. So that you get the feeding of the 5,000, you get the calming of the storm, you get the walking on the water, you see it in the miraculous catch of fish, you see it in healing people, in restoring sight to the man born blind, and in raising the dead to life. So that feature of God controlling nature through Jesus appears also in this triumphal entry into Jerusalem. So of those things here in our collects, we ask more than once in these collects for this service, help us mercifully grant that we may walk in the way of his suffering and share in his resurrection. We say that we want to follow him because that is the way of Jesus, is the way of salvation. So we let this week, this Holy Week, take us to a new level of obedience to God, of trusting in God, and of loyalty to God. That, as it says in the Isaiah passage we just had, that our ear could be trained to listen for God's guidance. In the name of Christ, amen.